Well, hi, and welcome to week 3 of the Emotionally Healthy Woman podcast. I am your co-host, Kathy Bruce, and this podcast features a series of my conversations with author Geri Scazzero based on her book, The Emotionally Healthy Woman. And if you were with us last week, we talked about quit lying. And this week, we are discussing quit dying to the wrong things. So I would love now to introduce you to Geri Scazzero. Welcome, Geri, to the podcast.
Good morning, Kathy. Good to be with you.
Wonderful to be with you as well. I am so excited about this chapter that we're going to be delving into, quit dying to the wrong things. But before we get into that, I would love to know, just because it's the Tuesday after Valentine's Day, did you and Pete do anything special?
Pete and I did something very special, but it had nothing to do with Valentine's Day. It was my son-in-law's birthday. So that took, and they had been away. My daughter and son-in-law had been away for the weekend. So we had our grandchildren, 2 and 4. And so when they came back on Sunday, we celebrated his birthday that night, and we had a wonderful celebration. And Pete and I made a conscious decision to say, we will celebrate because we had things, we had cards and stuff for each other. And we would celebrate that Monday. But we were so exhausted on Monday from taking care of our grandchildren, we moved it to Tuesday. So hopefully tonight
So that's today.
Correct. So we will hopefully whenever we have the soul space to do it, in a meaningful way, our cards and gifts are there on standby.
Wonderful. Well, I'm thrilled you guys are able to get it in. I know you must have that must have been a very busy weekend, but it's so wonderful that you are close to family, that you're able to be with your grandkids. And
right. Well, we're not that close. I mean, they're 2 hours away. So they were willing to drive 2 hours to drop the kids off and then drive 2 more hours to the Catskills, because that's how much they loved, even stopping at a rest stop without children is like a vacation. So.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I remember those days.
How about you? What did you do for Valentine's?
Well, we celebrated at a little Irish restaurant upstate called Garvin's in New Paltz, New York. And it's funny because, my husband's Scottish, but we found this restaurant, this Irish man named Garvin, and he opened it. And it's just lovely. It's an old house that's renovated, and you go in and they have, they're open for dining now, as you may have heard, like places are now starting to open back up in the city as well too. So, but no, we just had a lovely dinner. Now that I have a teenager, we can actually go out on a date.
It's amazing. I know. Once they pass 12, it's amazing.
Yeah, he can stay home by himself and, pop the fish sticks in the oven.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we are, like I said, we are, for our listeners, so excited about this chapter. This is one of my favorite chapters, Geri. I know you had said last time we did the last podcast, this is a great chapter for you as well. I just think there's so much in here. So we have a lot of questions. I'm hoping I can get to all of them. We'll give it a go, but wanted to kind of start out, because I know when I've taught this class, the Emotionally Healthy Woman class, in previous groups at our church, sometimes women start reading this chapter not really understanding what quit dying to the wrong things actually means. And so I wanted to just highlight something that you say in this chapter, kind of describing the definition of what you're meaning by this when you say quit dying to the wrong things. And so you say in the chapter, it means depriving yourself of God-given gifts and pleasures that nurture your unique life in Him, or when you set aside or devalue activities that cause your soul to feel fully alive. And I just think this is profound. I mean, I just know as a woman, like over the years and different seasons of motherhood, becoming a wife, changing careers, all of these things, setting aside and devaluing activities that cause your soul to feel fully alive. I know I have done this in different seasons and still struggle with it. And so I was wondering if you could share with the listeners, what are some of the things over the years in your own life that you realized that you had either set aside or devalued?
Or just been unaware of how critical they were to my healthy personhood,
Yeah.
because they are things that gave me life and joy. And actually, I wasn't even aware. I don't think I could name them, um, until I didn't have them.
Mm.
And so when we began ministry, planning our church in New York City, we were just so busy. Um, and now I'm married to someone who would have different interests than myself. And so I I was living in New York. I didn't have access to nature. I was away from my family, so I didn't have access to my extended family. I didn't realize how much, even as a single person, how much time you can have alone.
Mm.
That for me was restorative. Now, all those things were gone. I didn't have, access to those things. And so we worked 6 days a week, and we basically, collapsed on the seventh day.
Mm.
And that wasn't restorative at all. And so I just began to just sort of shrink, I think, emotionally in my soul, until the point of realizing, that I was miserable, quit the church. That got me on the journey of realizing this whole understanding of the things that bring me life, that they are so, and that every one of us have things that bring life to how we are made. Pete is made differently than me. You are made differently than me. And so different things bring different people life, but those things that bring us life are, I like to call, oxygen to the soul.
Mm.
Actually, oxygen. And when we are deprived of them, just our whole sense, our whole self really shrinks, and the life begins to come out of us. And the problem in ministry for us at that time was a misunderstanding of what, dying to self meant. And we thought dying to self meant, it was synonymous with sacrifice,
Mm.
sacrifice, and you're dying to self.
Right.
But anyway, so my life verse, which had been, if any person would come after me, let them, deny self, take up their cross and follow Christ. But I had a very narrow and actually wrong interpretation of that verse. And it almost killed me because I was
Mm.
denying parts of myself that were so critical to a healthy self.
Mm. And how, so I'm, yeah, I'm just thinking about how poignant this is in COVID right now.
Mm,
Like, I mean, it just occurred to me, how much even harder it is.
it is double whammy.
It is. It's like a double whammy with this being a temptation to die to the wrong things to begin with, and then to have COVID layered on top of that, where some of the things that might be life-giving and soul-giving and oxygen aren't even available to us anymore.
It is true.
So, I mean, I'm just wondering, how would you describe how someone could, figure out if they've been dying to the wrong things? Like, how
Mhm.
did you figure it out?
Yeah. Again, I think that's why there's so many really mental health crises going on right now in
Mm.
COVID. Because one, people maybe to begin with don't, especially again, leaders, right? Because leaders have so many other things they're dealing with. They so much need the oxygen for their souls
Mm.
so that they can lead others. And in COVID, if you didn't know, if you don't know to begin with what brings your life to your soul, and then you've got these restrictions where is even exasperating that. Yeah, there's a where a lot of people are in a big trouble. So how did I learn? Try to think. How did I learn what brought my soul? I just began to pay attention to things that began, I began to be able to identify things that brought me life that I was no longer doing. So
Mm.
I knew the outdoors brought me such joy. And actually, so I needed to begin to pay attention when I had joy.
Mm. Mhm.
And I remember us visiting the Adirondacks one season, summer maybe it was. And when I stepped out of the car, I immediately had joy flooding my body
Mm.
because the smell of the pine needles, the swaying of the trees, the water in the distance. I mean, just all of these things were bringing, and I was like, wow, I've got to pay attention. And so it is, it's very, very important to just begin to pay attention to when you are experiencing joy.
Mm. How would you say trying new things, like being intentional about trying new things would be helpful too? Because I just know I went through a period in my life, I think when I was transitioning after I had my son,
Mm,
of just not even knowing, like, I felt like I didn't have any hobbies anymore. I felt like I just, just the routine, the getting on the the hamster wheel of life, just continual work, parent, all that. And I didn't even know anymore. So I'm trying to remember. I think I just started trying some things
mm,
like and
mm.
being like, oh, do I enjoy this? Or I
Right.
don't know. Would that
Right.
be another helpful way to
So you know what? Many of the clues to our true self, and especially things that bring us life and joy, are found in childhood.
mm,
So look back to childhood, to what was fun for you, what brought you life, what brought you joy. So that's one way. Pay attention. The clues are there. And then of course that may become something different in adulthood. I mean, I was always a lover of recreation and fun in childhood and the outdoors, but something that I'm a very aware of in my adulthood is I love to explore new places.
mm,
I'm not sure that wasn't as evident in childhood, but still, it's for me, it's fun. It's fun to explore new places and then bring people, get to know that place, and then um, invite other people to enjoy those places. Show other people those places. So anyway, that's yeah. But
that's good.
yeah, and I think also yeah, you do have to try new things as an adult and realize, but it really is paying attention to when you're experiencing joy.
That's good. And like you said, that's also, we talked a little bit about this last week, of paying attention to your body. Like how, like when you're, like, I know when I get on a horse, I'm horse crazy. So horses are from my childhood. I love that you suggested that, because that's what I found in my adulthood has brought me joy again, is going
Yes.
horseback riding. And when I got on a horse, I just like relax. It's just, and
Mhm.
I experienced joy just going for a
Wow.
trail ride. So, and that was
Yes.
something that brought me a lot of joy as a kid. Uh,
Mhm.
that's awesome. I love
Yes.
that. But paying attention to your body, what things are giving that oxygen to your body as well, that
Yes.
signaling. Um, okay, so I want to talk a little bit about maybe what could create some of the barrier to this of not paying attention or getting into like that rat race I was mentioning before, of just the cycle of work and parenting, being a spouse, being a caretaker, all those kind of things. And one of the quotes I love that you mentioned, that a counselor once said to you in this chapter, is they said, the extent to which you love yourself is the extent to which you can love others well. And you mentioned sacrifice earlier. I mean, that statement, the extent to which you love yourself is the extent to which you can love others well. This really, I was thinking about it, flies in the face of so much of like the Christianese culture, where we're taught that, to be like Jesus is to be completely sacrificial, right? And just give up of yourself. And that's, being like Jesus. And I think as women, we have so many things to juggle when we wear different hats, like being a wife, being a mom, careers, caretakers, sometimes of elderly parents, things like that. And so many of these roles are wrapped up in sacrificially taking care of other people. So I mean, I just like, even thinking about this kind of like blows my brain. Like I have to constantly remind myself that I have to love myself. Right. So I just am curious, what do you think, why do you think this is so hard for women to, and men, this goes to men as well. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, it's just to embrace this reality that to love others, we have to first love ourselves well.
Yeah. I mean, so what was the script you were handed from your family of origin around uh, one being a woman, and what a
Mm,
woman does? And, to just reevaluate that. And then what's the script you're handed from uh, your denomination, your church? What's the script you're handed around that as to what it means to love? And so I think we have faulty, we have flawed scripts.
mm,
Um, you cannot give what you do not, there's a couple of things at play here. One is you cannot give what you do not possess,
mhm.
whether as a woman, as a believer in Christ. So it's not a truism that the more you sacrifice, the more you are loving. That is not true.
Mm. Can you
I
say
mean,
that again? Because
the
I
more,
think I need to hear that. And I know maybe our listeners need to
the
hear that
more
again.
you sacrifice, the more you are loving is not a truism. As a matter of fact, think about 1 Corinthians 13. I gave away everything to the poor. I gave my body to be burned at the stake, but I was not loving.
Mm,
I mean, it's right there. And so we have to re-examine the scripts that we were handed when something doesn't feel right. And so, earlier, previously, we talked about how do you know when you're dying to the wrong things? Well, you can be sacrificing, and you're miserable. You're not loving, you're miserable. And one of the ways you know you're dying to the wrong things is there's tiredness, there's resentfulness. You don't have the fruit of the spirit in your life.
mm.
So re-examine your family scripts, re-examine your church scripts, your denominational scripts, whatever. And um, yeah, love comes. We have limits as human beings. We cannot give and give and give. I say we're more like water coolers than wells in a sense. I mean, the water cooler runs out,
Right.
wells never run out. And but we need to refill, and God has given us ways to do that in a very healthy way. He's created each one of us uniquely with unique ways of receiving the oxygen to our souls. And it is critically important that we love and take care of ourselves so that we can love and take care of others.
Yeah. It's like that image of like putting on the oxygen mask on the
Absolutely.
airplane, right? Before. And that image came to me when COVID first hit, because I remember like we're almost coming up to a year in March now that we've been living with the COVID pandemic. And I remember thinking in COVID, those first couple of weeks where everything was so chaotic and we didn't know,
Right.
how long it was going to last or what we were dealing with. And it almost seems like ministry got so much busier during that time, just trying to pivot and figure everything out. And I remember being on Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting and realizing about 3 weeks in, I can't do this. Like
Right.
I got to get myself oxygenated before I can give out to anybody else. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That was a very, very difficult time. Um, so was there a question in there? I forget.
no, just like why you think it's hard for women to embrace this reality.
Oh, well, I mean, there's a lot of layers. There's
No,
a
I mean,
lot
I
of
think definitely answered. I think looking at the scripts is definitely a place to start. Looking at family of origin, what you're handed down.
yeah.
Um,
It takes a lot of courage. Don't underestimate the courage it takes to change your scripts. Imagine, I mean, and now the church is telling or I'm not telling you, but maybe they are telling you directly, or you've internalized, or indirectly, you've got these messages from the church. So now you got these messages from the family and the church, and they're just not true. And that takes a lot of courage to go against ways that you have been formed and believed all of your life. It takes a lot of courage.
mm, yeah, and I think just how you talked about finding those things, even just maybe starting with a simple step of being aware of what brings you joy, um, can be a place to start. Like you're not going to conquer changing that, all at once, but
Right.
but a
And I
place
think
to start.
when we bring people into when we bring leaders into reality of the disconnect between what they think they're living and what they are living. So
Mm,
they think they're being loving, but they're miserable. And so going back to the oxygen, the flight attendant on the plane who says, listen, if we are in a crisis on the plane and the oxygen masks come down and you have a small person, person who really can't help themselves, before you help them, you've got to put on your own oxygen mask.
mm.
Because why? She who is dead cannot help very many people. And
Is that a Geri proverb?
yes, and then here's a Chinese proverb which I love,
good.
which takes it a step further. She who is not happy cannot help very many people.
Mm,
And
amen.
there's no rule, even though we may think about it in the church, like we think, the more miserable we are, the more value there is in our sacrifice. And it's just not true. It's a faulty theology of God. God has created us to enjoy his world immensely. I mean, it would be like me creating an amazing meal for my family, and then there's nobody to enjoy it. Like, what's the point? I
Yeah.
get just as much joy from creating the meal. I get then just as much joy as watching them enjoy it.
Right.
And God gets so much joy out of us delighting in so many things in the world he has created for us, that gives us oxygen. And again, it's just part of the way I think he has created us and the world, that, the world, love does make the world go round.
Yeah. And I think you just hit on a really important point. It's that's sort of centered in your view of God as well. The fact that, like, you mentioned that he actually is delighting and seeing us delight in his creation, right? Like that's a very specific view. That's a very different view of God, I think, sometimes than people may have of of God. But we could spend a whole other podcast talking about that. Yeah. But I want to get to one other thing. You mentioned I would love for you to touch on a little about your usage of the prayer of examine. How has this been helpful to you? And can you first say what it is, and then, for our listeners who don't know what it is, and then how it's been helpful?
The prayer of examine is a way of reflecting on what's going on inside of you. And there are many, many variations to the prayer of examine. So you can Google prayer of examine and you will come up with very, simple to very complex, to prayers of examine for the day, how to do it daily, how to do it weekly, how to do it over a 6-month period. But essentially, at the root of the prayer of examine is, what is going on inside of me that is bringing me closer to God and myself, which again are sort of, they're totally interconnected.
They're linked.
Right. Or is it or things that have been moving me away from God? So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And again, many questions can be asked in the prayer of examine. There are many variations to it, but at the root of it is, what has brought your soul life this week, and what has brought your soul death? Paying in particular to your emotions. Emotions are, I would say, are a pretty important part of the prayer of examine. And so again, many times what brings me joy and brings me life, brings me closer to God. And what brings me death usually, but not always,
Right.
So for example, a conflict. Maybe I had a conflict with someone this past week and it was like death. But behind that conflict is, wow, parts of myself came out that I need to die to. Maybe I was critical, I was condescending, or I cut the person off, or I'm avoiding them now. I mean, there's a lot that can happen. And that's why it's not a superficial thing. Sometimes when we're reflecting on our souls and what's going on inside of us and our emotions, and we'll address this more in depth next week.
Right.
Just huge around, denying emotions. But anyway, our emotions have layers, but all of it to say that we must reflect on our interior life if we are to grow in our walk with God.
Mm, that's so good. So good. And that kind of helps us do this a little bit of wrap up. I wanted to talk about just sort of an application to this whole chapter. I mean, there's so many good tools, the prayer of examine you mentioned, but this idea of really understanding our true self. So you talk about in the chapter, understanding these three pieces: our heart, our story, and our personality. And so could you touch for a moment on, just what are there other tools that you would recommend perhaps to start that self-discovery process?
Well, certainly we just talked about the prayer of examine being a tool for the heart. But again, you don't even need a tool. And we'll talk more about that next week. How do I reflect on my heart and what's going on inside of it? Let's see. What do we say? Heart, family, and
heart, story, and personality. And a personality. We were going to talk a little bit. We had talked a little bit about this earlier because we were talking about you and I were talking about the Enneagram.
Right. And then we talked about heart, which in the prayer of examine, we talked, and we'll talk about that next week. And then story, we talked a little bit about today, because you got to really reflect on your scripts that you were handed, the messages you were handed from your family, from church, from wherever they came from in your life, and look at them in the truth of and the whole of scripture. And then personality, which is another piece that I grew so much in. I had so much misunderstanding around my personality. I all my whole life, the first 37 years of my life, I really thought I was a high extrovert. And I don't think I had ever done a personality inventory. And so began to do personality inventories. And I'm trying to think.
Do you remember the first one you did?
Yeah, what was the first one? It was the 9 personality traits. What is that called? There's I can't think of the name of it, but it was really, I'll have to come back. Maybe we can mention it next week or put it in the the post or whatever. And then of course there's the MMPI that
there's Myers-Briggs. There's DISC. Yes. Strength finders.
There's so many.
I know.
And of course, I happen to find one of the most helpful for me was the Enneagram, because the others, while they're really helpful, they usually are identifying your strengths, whereas the Enneagram helps identify your shadow and your strengths. But it was important for me to understand the shadow side of me, which is to say those parts that I'm projecting out on others, because underneath that shadow is hiding, is really blocking a way in which I get my self-worth. And so that shadow needed to really come out in the light, and the Enneagram really helps that.
You would you want to share with our listeners which number on the Enneagram you identify with?
Yes, I was easily identifiable. Some people, very few though, but a few people have. With the Enneagram, most people are able to find their personality, where they fall in the personality spectrum. And so anyway, for myself, I'm a number 1, which means that I really find my self-worth in improving things. Or sometimes it's called the need to be right, or the need to be right about being right, or perfectionism. These are all kind of shades of being a 1. And just, I want to remind our listeners that the Enneagram is meant to be really helpful. But like any tool, it can be used as to build, but it can also be built to hurt and destroy. And I think the Enneagram in particular can be damaging when people start making people numbers.
Right.
A person is much more than a number. We are so complex. I mean, we're our heart, we're our family scripts, we are our personalities. And so it's helpful if it serves as a tool to grow in self-awareness. But if we start pegging people or making them numbers. Like I kind of cringe when I hear say, they're a 4. They're just being 4-ish. And
Right.
that's where I want to say, let's not use it that way. And if
Yeah.
anything, just use it for yourself, not projecting onto others. Or it is helpful. It's helpful to understand other people in the context of their number, but it's much more important to be present to a person in the present moment.
Absolutely. And recognizing that it is a tool that is valuable information, but it doesn't pigeonhole someone into a certain way or behavior or way of being.
Right.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that, because I know there's tends to be some controversy out there, but I agree with you. I found it to be a very helpful tool personally, just for information about learning who I am and things I enjoy and things I don't enjoy, and ways that I can be resourceful and not resourceful.
Right. I mean, for me, it was a painful discovery. painful, but again, liberating.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are actually out of time. I know we could probably spend a whole podcast talking about the Enneagram, but I'm so thankful for this conversation today, and I hope that our listeners have not only walked away with some good practical tools to learn more about their true selves, but also just to how to start paying attention to things that maybe they've been dying to, that actually are things that they should bring back into their life, that are life-giving. So.
Yes, and the opposite side of the coin of dying to the wrong things is, and I must say this in closing, is not dying and not dying. How do I want to say this? We're dying to the wrong things, and we're not dying to the things we should be dying to, which that's why this chapter carried. It was a tragedy. It was I mean, when I say tragedy, I mean tragedy. When I woke up to the reality that it was a tragedy. I was dying to the wrong things, but in some ways it was even a greater tragedy that I wasn't dying to the right things, like the things that I needed to be dying to and denying. I'm doing all this self-denial, but in the wrong areas.
Yeah.
And that's why my Christianity was pretty limited.
Yeah, that's so good.
So read the chapter to find out what you do need to die to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you to our listeners for tuning in today. And our next podcast, we're going to be looking at, Geri said, as our emotions to quit dying to anger, sadness, and fear. So we hope to have you join us next time on the Emotionally Healthy Woman podcast. Thanks for joining us.